Sometimes when reading through the scriptures, you find things that seem to be a little peculiar. You look at certain passages, certain verses in the scriptures, and the way that they were written, it is as if there is something that the writer assumes you know, but you have no idea what it is. And so things seem to be a little incomplete in some way, for some reason. And it can be difficult to identify what these things are, especially if you don't know anything about the culture that the writer was writing to, who he was writing to, what people believed at that time, and the assumptions that they made concerning the living God, the Messiah, what he would come to accomplish, things related to how people lived at that time. Sometimes we can get some help from encyclopedias or from books that describe manners or customs that took place in the scriptures. Sometimes we can find some good information, but sometimes we can't, and so it's difficult to understand some things. You can tell something is just missing. Something is just missing there. A very good example of this that people sometimes run into is found in the Gospel of John, chapter 1. In the Gospel of John, chapter 1, Jesus was calling disciples to himself, and one of the disciples, Philip, went and found a friend of his by the name of Nathanial. So he brought Nathaniel to Jesus and told Nathaniel, "We have found the Messiah. He comes from Nazareth. His name is Jesus." And Nathaniel says, "My goodness, can anything good come out of Nazareth?" Well, where did he get that idea from? Why would he say something like that? Is there something wrong with Nazareth? Well, back then, Nazareth was considered to be a little bit of a rough place. And so when people would make jokes about some people in some areas, sometimes they would talk about the Nazarenes, the people who were in Nazareth. They would make jokes about them, and people just generally understood that if somebody made a comment like that, it was a poor attempt at humor, but it was a form of humor nonetheless. In today's time, in the modern age, people will sometimes make jokes about certain people who come from certain geographical areas or ethnic groups or religious backgrounds, things like that. People will sometimes make jokes, and this was a common way that people would talk to each other back then as well. The Nazarenes were often picked on for various reasons. Well, Philip said, "Come and see. Come and see for yourself." And so Nathanael went to Jesus, and when Jesus saw him coming, he said, "Behold, an Israelite in whom there is no deceit." Now, that's a very powerful thing to say, especially if this person doesn't know who you are. If he didn't know who Nathanael was, then how could he make a claim to say that this is a person within whom is no deceit, that this person has no deceit within them, that they are an upstanding individual, that they have a sense of integrity and honor? How would he know such a thing? And so Nathanael asked him, "Well, what makes you think that? How would you know that?" I'm going to read about this in John chapter 1, beginning in verse 45. In John chapter 1, verse 45, it says that Philip found Nathanael and said to him, "We have found him of whom Moses in the law and also the prophets wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph." In verse 46 it says, "And Nathanael said to him, 'Can anything good come out of Nazareth?' Philip said to him, 'Come and see.' Jesus saw Nathanael coming toward him and said of him, 'Behold, an Israelite indeed in whom is no deceit.' Nathanael said to him, 'How do you know me?' Jesus answered and said to him, 'Before Philip called you, when you were under the fig tree, I saw you.'" And then, what does Nathanael say? Jesus just tells him, "Well, I saw you under the fig tree earlier." Nathanael responds with a very interesting response. In verse 49, he says, "Nathanael answered and said to him, 'Rabbi, you are the Son of God, you are the King of Israel.'" Now, how could he go from, "I saw you under the fig tree," to, "You are the Son of God, you are the King of Israel"? I mean, that's a big step, isn't it? To make that kind of a leap, to say something like that. I would find that to be unusual, somewhat unusual. People don't normally respond in that kind of a way to say, "Well, I saw you over there, you were over there, and I just noticed you. You are the Son of God. What kind of a conversation is that? Well, there are some things being said here that I think a person can identify if they understand the key words that are being used here. First of all, we have the key word being used, deceit. And that's a very important word, that he identifies Nathaniel as someone in whom is no deceit. And then the other thing is that he says that he saw him under the fig tree. Those are very significant phrases. They were very significant phrases during this time in history in the nation of Israel. First of all, let's start with the fig tree. With the fig tree, what would he be doing under a fig tree? What's he doing there? Didn't people sit under fig trees? Of course they did. But if a person sat under a fig tree, it was assumed at that time that they would be under the fig tree for one purpose. It wouldn't be to be looking for figs. If they were going around looking for figs, they wouldn't be sitting down. They would be looking for figs. But in this case, if somebody is sitting under a fig tree, the rabbis taught at that time that the reason why somebody should be under a fig tree would be to study the Scriptures or to meditate on the Scriptures. That was an assumption that people could legitimately make if they saw somebody under a fig tree. That would mean that they were studying the Scriptures or they were meditating on the Scriptures. In fact, there were many rabbis during this time who would only teach under a fig tree. They would not teach under any other tree. Why? What would be so significant about the fig tree? Why not some other tree? What's such a big deal about the fig tree? Well, this goes all the way back to the Garden of Eden. In the Garden of Eden, there was a tree of life, and there was a tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Now, we don't know for sure what the tree of life was. There has been some speculation. I personally have the opinion that it was probably an olive tree, or it was a tree that bore a different fruit for each month in the year. There are many different opinions concerning that. But the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, there has been some very good speculation that the tree of the knowledge of good and evil was probably a fig tree. Now, I have an opinion concerning this, and of course I don't know for sure because we don't have that much information to know for sure. But I believe that the tree of the knowledge of good and evil was a fig tree because as soon as they ate from the wrong tree, from that fruit, they realized that they were naked and that they needed some clothing, and so they grabbed a fig leaf. And it's my belief that that was probably the nearest leaf that they could reach for. And so for that reason, no other divine inspiration, divine revelation involved here. I just simply believe that because it was the first leaf that they reached for, it was probably the fig tree. In addition to that, in some places in the Scriptures, you will see that the fig or the fig tree has an association with the knowledge of good and evil. So I believe that the fig tree represented, or there was a representation that could be found, that the fig tree was representative of the knowledge of good and evil. And this is what the rabbis believed. They believed that it was a fig tree. Now, I gave my reason. They have different reasons, but this is just simply my reason, that it was the nearest leaf that they could reach for. There are other reasons that the rabbis have speculated on, but that is one of the motives as to why they would only teach under a fig tree. And why? Why would they only teach under a fig tree? What would they teach? That's where the answer is found. It's based on what they would teach. What were they teaching? Well, the Scriptures, with regards to the Old Testament, the Old Covenant that they had, that they were teaching at that time, those Scriptures were the law of Moses. That was the law. It was God's contribution to mankind's great effort to try to be like Him through the knowledge of good and evil. It is a description of the knowledge of good and evil. And so they made that association between the fig tree, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and learning about good and evil. That's where that came from. And so for this reason, there were many rabbis who would never teach unless you were under a fig tree. So if Nathaniel was found under a fig tree, he would be meditating on the Scriptures. That's what he would be doing, unless he was there with a rabbi who was teaching him. In this case, there is no indication that I can see that he was there with somebody else, and so chances are he was there by himself meditating on the Scriptures. Now, which Scriptures would he be meditating on? Well, there was a schedule that the rabbis used at that time to go through the Scriptures in a year, and there were sections in the Scriptures that they would study during certain times of the year. This time of the year, I believe, was around Passover. I don't have absolute proof for that, but I do believe that a good approximation is around Passover. And around Passover, I don't know exactly where they would be for sure, but I have confidence that they would be nowhere near Genesis, especially the passages that refer to Jacob. I don't think that they would be anywhere near there. But why would I mention Jacob? Well, Jacob was an Israelite. He was the first Israelite. When Jesus identified Nathaniel as an Israelite, he was making an association with Nathaniel and Jacob. Now, Jacob was recognized as somewhat of a deceptive individual. If you were to read about his life, you'll see that he was not necessarily as honest as perhaps you would like. He was recognized as a deceiver in some cases, or as a deceptive person. So when Jesus identified Nathaniel as an Israelite in whom there is no deceit, well, that says something. That says enough to get your attention, especially if that's what you were recently thinking about. If that's something you were studying recently, meditating on recently. And that would be a little peculiar, especially during this time of year, because that wasn't the assigned passages that everyone else was studying. So when Jesus said, I saw you under the fig tree, in connection with you are an Israelite in whom there is no deceit, it is my belief, again, I don't have absolute proof for this, but when I read this, this is what I see. It's my belief that he was telling Nathaniel, Nathaniel, I know what is in your heart. I know that you are a person who does not want to be deceptive. You want to be a person of integrity, of honor. You want to live honestly. You want to be a man of God. I see you in that way. And I know that you were meditating on some passages in the Scriptures, some verses about Jacob. And this is not the correct passages that you would have been meditating on under the fig tree during this time of year, because this is not what people were studying and meditating on according to the rabbinical schedule of studying through the Scriptures. And so I believe because of that, Jesus told Nathaniel that he knew what was in his heart, and he confirmed to him that he knew what was in his heart because he knew that Nathaniel was meditating on something that no one would have expected him to be meditating on. And so he responded and said, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel. And then Jesus responds to that and gives him more evidence, more to respond and say to Nathaniel, I know why you would say that. He responds by referring to the passages relevant to Jacob. More specifically, what he was probably meditating on. Beginning in verse 50, it says, Jesus answered and said to him, because I said to you, I saw you under the fig tree. Do you believe? You will see greater things than these. And then in verse 51, and he said to him, most assuredly I say to you, hereafter you shall see heaven open, and the angels of God ascending and descending upon the Son of Man, referring to the dream that Jacob experienced when he was sleeping on a rock after he left his father's household. And he dreamed about the angels ascending and descending at the very location that he was at. And so when Jesus said that to him, I believe he further clarified and qualified and explained to him that yes, he knew exactly what was in Nathaniel's heart. How dare, you could say how dare, or how could Nathaniel question him when he says, I see you as a man without deceit. Let me show you how I really know, because he knew exactly what he was meditating on privately when no one was around, not even Jesus per se, except that he said that he saw him under the fig tree. So this is a very good example of why it can be important to understand the culture of that time, to understand the religious beliefs of the people at that time, even though you shouldn't necessarily agree with them, but to understand what they believed and how they lived, because through that we can gain a better understanding of what we see in the Scriptures that the writer may assume you know and just may not share that with you because of the lack of space that they would be able to write on in the paper that they, or the parchments that they would have at their disposal.